This is not a full group. We've got there's a group turning up who's apparently going to be a little bit late. But hopefully they won't. They'll just turn up quite early. Right, let's do this properly. Good evening. Good evening. That's a really good start. This is going to be a good one. My name's John. I'm obviously your guide for this evening. Just very, very quickly, two things before we start. We were okay getting across the road there, got the old green man and everything like that. If we're waiting at the side of a road and I'm not crossing, even if it looks okay, if you just hang on, wait for me, because obviously we're a largest group and it takes us longer to cross over. Try and get over all in one go where possible. If we are split up halfway crossing over, we will wait for you on the other side. Alright, so don't worry about that. Watch out for the bikes. That's a very important thing. And the other thing is for any point this evening you detect a mysterious presence behind you, it's not him. Right? It's probably someone who's walking past going, wondering what's going on. But if they are one of these show-offs who decide they might want to sort of heckle, usually they just go, "Get the river!" and stuff like that. Don't reply to them in case they're a bit silly. And we'll just move on, okay? Otherwise, this area is completely safe. No, that is extremely unlikely. Anyway, enough of this banter. Welcome everybody then to the tour, and welcome to the historic and very unusual East End of London. Is anyone here familiar with this part of London at all? Anyone? Some of you are work here, live here, that sort of thing. It's got a lot of rich, diverse history. Some would even say some of the history is a bit weird. It's fascinating stuff, and it's certainly different from the history you'll get over in the usual tourist traps, usually over in the West End. And it's known for a lot of things, this neighbourhood. But this area that we're in now is Whitechapel, as I'm sure you're aware, and it's that name, isn't it? Whitechapel, that's famous for one thing over and above everything else that this neighbourhood is known for. It's the reason you're here, obviously. What I suppose you could officially call the Whitechapel Murders of 1888, a so far unsolved series, unsolved, got it? Don't believe everything you've seen on TV. Unsolved series of quite frankly horrific murders committed by the world's most well-known serial killer. Doesn't mean he was the first one. He was probably the first modern one, meaning the first one that everyone in the world knew about, thanks to the media. Somebody gave him a name at the time, conveniently enough. It's a name we still use 125 years later, so it's a bit of an anniversary at the moment. And he is, of course, the Ripper. Well, it's a bit lively, that. Some people do get carried away and go, "Jack the Ripper!" which is all a bit the other way to how we think of him, isn't it? I mean, admit it. How many of you think of Jack the Ripper as the man with walking through the fog in the dark with his top hat and his glinting knife, the cape and the little black bag, the sinister gentleman? That is the sort of image that a lot of people have. I'm afraid it's not the right image, to be honest with you. It's a mythological, folklore image generated by the movies, I'm afraid. That's a bit of a disappointment, that, isn't it? Should we just go down the pub? Yeah. But yeah, there are a lot of people who think that is how it was. It's very difficult sometimes to separate the myth from the reality of it all, to the point where there are people in the world who think this story came from a movie or from the pen of a Gothic novelist from Victorian times. It is a real story. You're going to hear the important parts of the real story this evening, seeing some of the locations, or several of the locations actually, where some of the events did actually happen. And I'm going to warn you now, if you are not that aware of exactly what Jack the Ripper did to his unfortunate victims, be prepared to do this. Because they weren't shocking for nothing. Some people do get a bit of a surprise when they find out exactly what he did. So you've got strong stomachs? Yeah. Anyone of a nervous disposition? Confess. No? Okay. There's usually someone who stands next to someone and goes, like that. Anyway, so they were shocking then, and to be honest with you, they're still shocking now. In any case, a little bit of background, because it's often been suggested that the reason those murders took place in this very unusual location is because of the way this area was at the time. By the 1880s, London as a whole had actually become the largest city in the world. And because at the centre of it, that little neighbourhood over there, which we call the Square Mile, the City of London, the financial district, was at its centre. And because that was the financial district like it is today, and also the centre of world trade, and also the heart of the British Empire, that Square Mile next to us was the wealthiest and most powerful place on earth. Right? No contest. Right? Unfortunately, in the 1870s, the previous decade, there'd been something called, what they eventually called the Long Depression, right? Which is effectively a recession. Which sounds awful, and I'm glad we won't have one in our lifetime, because they sound really bad, you know what I mean? Any case, no, we have got one, that's the problem. And the problem with recessions, they create all sorts of problems. And what this one did is pretty much split London in half. In other words, over in the West End, you had the wealth and the privilege. In the middle, you got the city, which is the wealth and the power. And then over in the East End, where all the factories were, where the London docks were, you had poverty on a scale that I have to say would not be tolerated today. It would be a scandal. The Industrial Revolution is partly to blame, because obviously this is where all the factories were. So people coming in from the Shires and other parts of Britain to work in the factories. Also, of course, you've got the London docks down the road. So the first point of settlement for immigrants is usually Whitechapel in the days before airports, things like that. So this area began to fill up very quickly during the 19th century, and that overcrowding led to these terrible problems. First thing being, of course, there weren't enough jobs for the people that wanted them, which basically created that poverty. Some people couldn't find work for days, weeks on end, things like that, and therefore homelessness became a big problem. If you did have a home, sometimes you wouldn't have a home like we would think of one today. You might just have to share a room with 8 or so members of your own family. Can you imagine doing that? 8 members of your own family, one room, no toilet, no taps, no running water, that sort of thing. I mean, that was considered to be quite normal in this area. And of course that gives problems with sanitation. The disease that was big problems in here, cholera outbreaks and things like that, led to a shocking mortality rate. Just under 50% of the children born here were dead before they were 5 years old. I mean, that is how bad it was considered. I know that all sounds a bit depressing, but don't worry, it will cheer up later on when people start getting murdered. Right? That's how it goes. But that's how it was considered. And for years, people tried to change the terrible conditions here. It was almost a problem insolvable on its own terms. Everything, no matter how hard they tried, it all just came back to being terribly poor. Crime, of course, was another problem, because when you ain't got a lot of money, you might try all sorts of different ways to earn a living, as it were. So there were street robberies, drunken brawls, burglary, and the East End's famous for its markets. Petticoat Lane, you may have heard of, Brick Lane Market, Watney Street Market down the road. Wonderful places to go selling off stolen goods. There is a legend that if you went to the bottom end of Petticoat Lane Market, you could quite easily have your pocket watch stolen from your pocket. But no, don't worry, because by the time you got to the top end of Petticoat Lane, there'd be someone there willing to sell it back to you. Right? So that's the sort of the nature of the beast. Murder, though, was quite rare. I think people were too busy dying of other things. Bronchitis was the biggest killer at that point. Until the autumn of 1888, when somebody took it upon themselves to quite literally slaughter the most vulnerable class of people in this area. The women of Whitechapel, who could not find legitimate work and therefore had no choice but to go on the streets and sell themselves. Prostitution was such a big problem in this area that the Metropolitan Police that year, 1888, estimated well over 1,200 operating prostitutes in Whitechapel. And that's an area that's not even as big as Hyde Park. Right? So you get an idea of the epidemic, as it were. And these prostitutes were utterly desperate. Many of them were homeless, many of them were alcoholics. They didn't have wealthy clients like their counterparts in the West End, and it made them extremely cheap. 4p was how much it would cost to go with one of these ladies. It was called the 4-penny knee trembler. And I'm not demonstrating it, right, if you don't know what it is. That's about 91p in today's money. That's very cheap. Basically what that was, the women would take a man down an alleyway, side turning, open stable yard gates, corners like that one, and there's a legend, and I know it to be true actually, that if you lived in a house that was very overcrowded and never bothered locking your front door, the prostitutes would find out about it and would sneak into your house and use any empty rooms or your backyard to do their business. So nowhere was sacred, really. In other words, they just went to really quiet, lonely places that weren't well lit, that didn't have regular police patrols. And it made their job very dangerous, it made them very vulnerable, and they were prone to being attacked by gangs of criminals. Sometimes women died from injuries after being beaten up by in robberies and things like that. In other words, the point I'm going to make is that all the victims of Jack the Ripper, whoever he was, were prostitutes. They literally led him to the sort of places where he could quite literally get away with murder. When you think about how many of these vulnerable women there were in this area, they're sitting targets everywhere. It would have been very easy. And that's possibly the explanation why those murders were done in this area. Indeed, they highlighted the social problems at the time. Jack the Social Redeemer has often been called, that he purposefully did this to make people realise how terrible the conditions were. But that's another theory on top of many others. Now, The Whitechapel murders, as they are officially recorded, are about 13 murders spanning 3 years, from 1888 to 1891. There is a lot of debate as to which of these women were killed by the same person, the person we call Jack the Ripper. And most experts, and certainly most detectives back in the day, believe that out of those 13, there's really only about 5 that they are confident were all killed by the same person, the person we call Jack the Ripper. If you've heard of those 5 names, you'll be familiar with Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly. In that order, 10 weeks, what became known as the Autumn of Terror. There is a possible prelude, however, to those. And I don't know if anyone's read anything about the murders. You might have heard of a name, Martha Tabram. Now, for some, she could be the first of 6 victims. Murdered on August 7th, 1888, the summer bank holiday that year, found dead in a pool of blood on the first floor landing of George Yard Buildings, a small tenement block in the heart of Whitechapel. She was lying in a pool of blood. What was unusual about her death is that she had been stabbed 39 times. Now, 38 wounds, apparently done with a small penknife, had punctured most of the vital organs, including the heart. That's enough to kill her on its own. One wound was a bit different. The doctor reckoned it could have been something about that long or that wide, because he reckoned it was a bayonet. If you've seen one of those, you wouldn't want to be on the other end of one, believe you me. That had actually gone through the breastbone, so that's a pretty horrendous injury. Believe it or not, though, nobody in that building, all its residents, heard any noise during the night, so it's a total mystery. And eventually the police exhausted all their inquiries, it all fell flat, and the only thing they could think of was this might be the work of a gang, especially since there were 2 weapons used. It wasn't until later on, when other women started falling, that they began to put Martha Tabram in with those other 5. And so for many, she could be the first, which is why we start up this small alleyway, right? Because it's called Gunthorpe Street today. 100 years ago, until 100 years ago, it was known as George Yard. The George Yard buildings used to be at the far end on the left-hand side. We're going to go past the spot in a minute. It's now replaced by Sunley House, which is that red brick building we're going to go past. And there is a reason why I'm not standing in front of Sunley House. Firstly, there's usually cars parked in front of it. The other thing is, it's a nice day, isn't it? And people tend to have their windows open. And when they've got their windows open, there's a gentleman in Sunley House who, whenever he hears me speaking, greets me from within with a genuine Cockney greeting. 2 words. The second one is always off. And there's a guy on the other side who's even worse. The air turns blue, believe you me. So we don't want to upset the locals. As we go up, you see Sunley House. That is where Martha Tabram was murdered, for many the first official victim of the Ripper. However, most people think Mary Ann Nichols is the first, who was murdered 3 weeks later. The first one to be given the cut throat and the abdominal mutilations we associate with the Ripper, and also the first one to excite the interest of national newspapers. Not just the locals, the nationals. And also, especially, the tabloids. Because they had tabloids in those days, that's concentrated on sensation and things like that. But today, our tabloids concentrate on sex and celebrity, do they not? In those days, sex was a bit of a, sex. What the Victorians were like. So, in the absence of that, they chose mindless violence to get their kicks. They loved gore, blood, murder, death, horror, and these murders were reported in unbelievable detail by these tabloids, exciting the local population, creating a sensation that still hangs around today, and in some ways, sometimes, upsetting the police and interfering with the official investigation. So we'll hear more about the naughty newspapers, because they have a lot of bearing on how these murders are considered. As we go up the road, these photographs here are for you to look at. I hold them up and I pass them round. All right, so if I suddenly do this, take them off me. And if you've got any questions, if you just hang on until I say any questions, right, that's the giveaway really, I'm more than happy to answer them, because it makes every tour different for me to ask some questions. So, the date is August the 31st, we've just passed the anniversary. The murder of Mary Ann Nichols. Are you ready?
Yes!
Splendid! This way.